Thank you very much, Mark. Good afternoon, buenas tardes. I am very sorry that I could not deliver this speech in both Spanish and English, but I am so pleased that we have friends that will be supportive and help me out in this regard. Want to not only thank Caravans for Peace for bringing this initiative here to Baltimore, but thank you for your efforts to lift up the issues of the war on drugs, why it's a failure, what it has done in our communities, not only in the United States, but throughout the world. It is very important work that you do, and it is work that unfortunately will have to continue for several years to come. In 1914, a law was passed in the United States called the Harrison Act. That began what we currently call the war on drugs. In 2014, unfortunately, we will be celebrating the 100th year of the war on drugs. It is my hope that at least in that year, we can have peace and not continued war. Let me acknowledge, before I give my very brief remarks, the fact that we do have two local elected officials here in the audience. And I want to acknowledge a member of our state legislature, State Delegate Dan Morheim, who's also a physician. And I want to acknowledge the state's attorney for Baltimore City, who's been a very progressive prosecutor, Mr. Greg Bernstein. I mentioned to you that the war on drugs in the United States started in 1914. I want to highlight for you, though, a comment by a man who was a police chief and the president of the International Association of Chiefs of Police back in 1936. His name was August Vollmer. He was an outstanding progressive law enforcement official. And he said at that time, and I quote him, "Drug addiction is not a police problem. It never has been and never can be solved by policemen. It is first and last a medical problem." That was in 1936, and yet we are still continuing to fight the battle today of trying to get our country and our policymakers to understand that the war on drugs is complicated. It is not a single silver bullet that will solve it, but most importantly, it is a health problem and not a crime problem. You bring to our attention, and I know that our hero, Senor Cecilia, has understood this, that it is an international problem, and not only international, but interconnected. That is, what happens in this war in one country affects what happens in this war on drugs in another country. We have seen the terrible, terrible impact of the war on drugs in Mexico recently. Not only in the large number of deaths, the rise in the cartels, but unfortunately in watching American policy, particularly the so-called fast and furious policy of selling weapons and trying to track those weapons, a very bad policy that has done more harm than good. We have seen what's happened in Colombia with the United States policy, so-called Plan Colombia, that was supposed to help that country, but in fact all that it did was to buy large numbers of helicopters that could be used by the military, not only to attack civilians, but to spray poisonous material in the areas of civilian populations. And then just yesterday, I pick up the New York Times and I cut this article out that says, United States suspends its anti-drug radar sharing with Honduras. What had happened is that as a part of the war on drugs, the United States sold technical information and intelligence, so-called spying operations to the government of Honduras, was supposed to be used to help fight the war on drugs, but the Honduran government ended up using it to shoot down civilian aircraft of people who were deemed suspicious by the government. Now, I want to point out there have been very positive things with respect to international involvement and our interconnectedness. Caravan for Peace, in coming here and explaining to communities in the United States how we share the agony of the war on drugs, is very important. Here in Baltimore, many years ago, we tried to make an improvement in fighting one aspect of the drug problem, which is the AIDS problem, the spread of AIDS. And we wanted to do that by having a sterile syringe exchange program. We were not very successful in getting the public to understand it until friends from overseas, from the Netherlands, came over and explained. It was law enforcement officials, it was public health officials from the Netherlands that came over and explained how the needle exchange could help reduce the spread of AIDS without increasing the criminal aspects of the war on drugs. So that was a very positive aspect of the international aspect of and the interconnectedness of the drug problem. But I have been disappointed, not only as a mayor. I was the mayor of this city for 12 years, and I was so proud of our community for being creative in trying to make sure we did more to treat those who had been drug addicted, and allowing us to do the needle exchange program, which helped so many AIDS victims. I'm very proud of Baltimoreans in their efforts to be creative. But I've been so disappointed at the national leaders, not just the Republicans, it's been the Democrats also. I thought that the Republicans would just look at the money that's being wasted on the war on drugs. They care so much about balancing the budget and doing efficient things with money. The war on drugs nationally is an absolute waste of dollars, and it should be converted from heavy on law enforcement to more on public health, but they didn't do it. And then when the Democrats came in, I thought, well, maybe there would be a change there. But as I said, we had this fast and furious policy, and then unfortunately our president decided to attack medical marijuana in California for reasons that I simply don't understand. Well, let me pause. I do understand. Because this is a very political issue. And when you look at the war on drugs going over for the last almost 100 years, you have to ask yourself, don't people understand the definition of insanity? That is, most people understand that if you do the same thing over and over and expect a different result, that is one definition of insanity. But the war on drugs, we continue to do the same thing over and over and expect a different result. Why? Why is that? Because the war on drugs is mostly about money and power. This is not about people just being addicted to drugs. It is awful about people being addicted to drug money. And you say, well, who's addicted to drug money? Well, look who benefits by the current policy that we have. People make big money on prohibition. Prohibition failed in the 1920s to make ours an alcohol-free America, and prohibition is failing today to make ours a drug-free America. But many people are making a lot of money. Drug cartels, of course, but financial institutions, many financial institutions, private corrections, people who make money building jails are very happy with the war on drugs as we have it today. and many who receive money for military misadventures also are happy with the current. So it's money and power, and we have to break the grip of that. And it is my hope that efforts like Caravans for Peace will do that. And in the United States, our key to starting a new method, a new approach, is by starting to accept the definition of our problem as it was laid out by a great American professor. His name was David Musto, and he wrote a book that described the drug problem as, quote, the American disease. Think about it. Think about it. The problem that he's saying is that this is primarily a health problem. Addiction and AIDS, which are related to the war on drugs, these things are health problems. And ladies and gentlemen, you don't arrest your way out of a disease. You don't prosecute your way out of a disease. And you don't incarcerate your way out of a disease. You have to come up with different strategies. So let us start by redefining this as a health problem, primarily a health problem and not a crime problem. We know the criminal justice system has a role to play. It's just not the primary role. It is the public health that should lead the way. So I'm asking you, as we welcome our friends for Caravans for Peace and all the friends who are considering doing something different about the war on drugs, let's think globally but act locally. Think globally but act locally. We know that this problem is an international problem. Our elected officials at the highest level are not about to do something about it, so we have to do something at the local level. And what is that? Well, we in the city, in the state, in the private sector, and our individual citizens have to carve out the ways in which we can work together. We can expand treatment for those who have been addicted. We can expand rehabilitation. We can also make sure that we are doing what some of these organizations are doing, which is to try to make sure that when people get arrested and serve their time, that if they've done well, they're good citizens, that they get to wipe that off their record, that they expunge that and get a fresh start. We need to give people a fresh start because there's so many young people that get involved early and yet want to go on and live wonderful and productive lives. You know, when George Bush, the president, was asked whether he ever did drugs as a young person, what he said was, when I was young and irresponsible, I was young and irresponsible. So he never admitted what we know he did as a young man, but he was able to get a fresh start. He was able to change the community, society supported him in a fresh start. And I think that that's what we owe our young people. And finally, because of my concern about involvement in citizenship, we ought to do all that we can to eliminate the laws that prevent people who have a criminal conviction from being able to vote. Right now, there are so many laws that restrict the ability of people to vote, and it makes such a huge difference. In 2008, in the presidential election in 2008 in the United States, 13% of African American men who by age were eligible to vote in that election were prevented from voting because of something that happened when they were very young. 13%, just think about that, how the difference that could make in an election. Well, there's much more that we can say, and I know you will hear from the panel and hear from those who have been victimized, but I just come to say that we all should be hopeful, that we can make change, that it may be slow, and we know that progress is sometimes very difficult, but I do believe that in 2014, we will no longer be using the term war as it relates to drugs, but by 2014, we will indeed be talking about peace. Thank you very much.
I, for one, want to thank the Honorable Mayor Kurt Schmoke for being here with us today and bearing the heat and the late start. He was a real trooper. What I want to do before he leaves, I want to formally make Mayor Kurt Schmoke a formal member, an honorary member of the Caravan for Peace.
Well, thank you very much, Mayor. It's an honor.
And the one thing that we've been doing with our members for the Caravan for Peace has been pinning them.
Oh, okay.
As we go across the country.
Thank you. That's
Thank
an
you
honor.
very much.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you.
And I want to acknowledge the state's attorney for Baltimore City, who's been a very progressive prosecutor, Mr. Greg Bernstein. I mentioned to you that the war on drugs in the United States started in 1914. I want to highlight for you, though, a comment by a man who was a police chief and the president of the International Association of Chiefs of Police back in 1936. His name. Thank you very much, Mark. Good afternoon, buenas tardes. I am very sorry that I could not deliver this speech in both Spanish and English, but I am so pleased that we have friends that will be supportive and help me out in this regard. I want to not only thank Caravans for Peace for bringing this initiative here to Baltimore, but thank you for your efforts to lift up. We will be celebrating the 100th year of the war on drugs. It is my hope that at least in that year, we can have peace and not continued war. Let me acknowledge, before I give my very brief remarks, the fact that we do have two local elected officials here in the audience. And I want to acknowledge a member of our state legislature, State Delegate Dan Morheim, who's also a physician. The issues of the war on drugs, why it's a failure, what it has done in our communities, not only in the United States, but throughout the world. It is very important work that you do, and it is work that unfortunately will have to continue for several years to come. In 1914, a law was passed in the United States called the Harrison Act. That began what we currently call the war on drugs. In 2014, unfortunately, his name was August Vollmer. He was an outstanding progressive law enforcement official. And he said at that time, and I quote him, "Drug addiction is not a police problem. It never has been and never can be solved by policemen. It is first and last a medical problem." That was in 1936, and yet we are still continuing to fight the battle today of trying to get our country and our